2x2 Rye. We are here for a live review of Basil Hayden's latest release. I'm Scott Hill from Flight Club, and I'm here with Basil Hayden himself. Basil, say hello.
We're not suggesting by doing this review together that we would have gone on the Ark together at the same time, 2x2.
Latest release has hit the shelves here in the last maybe couple months here in our Wichita market. It is the 4th, I believe, Basil Hayden release. We're going to take a look at a couple of the others. The original Basil Hayden, we've written about it before on our website. It's an old 8-year product. We'll give you a little more detail. Stephen, you can give a little more detail here in a minute. That was the original release. Now it's non-age stated. I believe maybe 2 years ago now, a year and a half ago, Basil Hayden released a rye whiskey. I've got that bottle right here. We'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. So that was their second release. And then last year they released the dark rye. I've got that one right over here. We're not going to look at this one today. It's enough difference. But then this year they released the 2x2 rye. Stephen, what can you tell us? Let's start here with the 2x2 rye. What do you know about this one?
Yeah, so the 2x2 rye, as its name implies, has 2 of something and then 2 of something else. And so what it's really trying to do is something that has been attempted by some other distilleries also. Is it's a blend of bourbon whiskey with rye whiskey, and it's a blend of 2 bourbon whiskeys and 2 rye whiskeys. Now, we don't know the proportions of each, but all that we know from Jim Beam is that it's a mix of a 5-year rye, a 7-year, quote, high rye. So instead of just being 51% rye, it's probably closer to maybe 70% rye. And then for the 2 bourbons that are mixed in, it's a 13-year bourbon and a 6-year bourbon. We all know that all 4 of these whiskeys are from Kentucky. They're straight ryes and straight bourbons. And when you hear the ages of these, you hear 5-year rye, 7-year rye, 13-year bourbon, and 6-year bourbon. You might be tempted to think, wow, this thing's got some pretty impressive age to it. But really, if you add all those up, the average age amongst them, if you were to assume that the proportions even were level or were even with one another, is still between 6 and 8 years, which is probably exactly how old Basil Hayden bourbon is. It started out as an 8-year bourbon, and now it's something between 6 and 8 years without having an age statement on it. So lest you be tempted to think that Basil Hayden 2x2 is giving you some extra age, in fact, it really might not be at all compared to the Basil Hayden small batch bourbon.
What do you know about standard Basil Hayden as far as their mash bill and sort of Jim Beam's bourbon profile in general?
You wrote a really good article on this actually a little while back, comparing the Basil Hayden to Old Grandad, and they actually have a common root. Apparently, Basil Hayden was a dude who distilled whiskey, and his recipe was actually really more carried forward by the Old Grandad brand under the Jim Beam umbrella. But Basil Hayden is actually part of Jim Beam's small batch series. So that would include Knob Creek as well. It would include Baker's. So it's Jim Beam stuff, but they put it under this other line of being called small batch, which you could say it just means it gets a fancier label than standard Jim Beam products. But I think each of those Jim Beam small batch products, that being, the Knob Creeks and the Basil Haydens, each have something kind of unique to offer in and of themselves. For Basil Hayden, it seems to be, it's 80 proof. It's universally known to be easy to drink, a great introductory bourbon, and that's really what it's been. Like I said earlier, it used to be age stated at 8 years. Now it's not. Somewhere between 6 and 8 years probably is what it's at. But that's kind of some background on Basil Hayden generally.
Yeah, the other release in that small batch series, I think, was Booker's. And that release came out, I think, in the late 1980s, if I remember correctly. And it was shortly after Jim Beam purchased the Old Grandad line from National Distillers, when that all kind of fell by the wayside. They brought over Old Grandad, who is Basil Hayden, and that allowed them to introduce sort of a new product, a higher end product with a fancy little belt label here under the Basil Hayden name, the small batch series.
And then the first of their, and by there I mean Basil Hayden, started to do some offshoots of its own recently. The first being the Basil Hayden Rye, and so as its name suggests, it's a rye whiskey. Do you know the rye percentage in that one, Scott? I'm not sure if I do.
I don't. The only thing I found interesting on the label on this is it says it's a rye, 2017 release, rye aged and blended with a rye rebarreled and new charred oak quarter casks. So it appears to be maybe their own rye distillate that they put some of it back into quarter casks and then blended the two together. It doesn't show any proportions on it. It doesn't show mash bill, anything like that. I mentioned to you before we got on here, being a Basil Hayden Rye whiskey, 80 proof, I'm trying to think, what in the Basil or in the Jim Beam family, what mash bill might it be, that sort of thing. And I grabbed a bottle of Old Overholt, and we'll talk about it here later as we go through it. But there's some similarities to it. I mentioned that it was rebarreled in quarter cask, new charred quarter cask. We'll get to that too, but it's not certainly like 100% back in these quarter casks. It's not that really intense new kind of craft flavor char. We'll get to that, but I suspect it's just a small portion of it that was put in that quarter cask and then blended together.
Yeah, I'm putting it in that quarter cask, I guess, to get it acts like it's older because of the smaller cask. They must have wanted it to taste a little bit older. We'll get to it, like you said. I'm not sure whether that was achieved or not. But I think it is an apt comparison, the Old Overholt to the Basil Hayden. And if people are able to taste them side by side and then look at the price side by side, I think there is only one conclusion they could reach.
We'll find out. We'll find out how good this Basil Hayden Rye is by itself.
Yeah. All right. Well, we've got to compare. We've got the Basil Hayden, just small batch bourbon, and then the Basil Hayden Rye, and then the 2x2. And I think tasting these three together, maybe the goal would be try to find out whether the 2x2 borrows more of its influence from the bourbon or more from the rye, or if it's really its own product in and of itself. And you can see which of the three you prefer.
Yeah, I think that's a great intro to what we're trying to accomplish today. So I say let's get into it. Where would you like to start? I was thinking maybe we would start with the standard bourbons, their oldest product. Do you want to start there, or where do you want to start?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And all these are 80 proof, and you really get that a lot in the nose of each, how the ethanol does not stand out whatsoever. And mask any of the other scents. At the same time, you really have to search more, I think, with these. And I get a lot of honey right up front, and some caramel. And there's a sweetness that underlies both of those for sure.
Yeah, I definitely get some vanilla as well as the flavors you just described. I get a little bit of citrus in there, like kind of lemon citrus, and maybe just some faint apple. Generally, I would say it's fairly traditional bourbon flavors is what you get on the nose.
Yeah, I'd agree. It's that corn grain sweetness that really comes through. There's not a lot of oak influence here that suggests that it's very old. But at the same time, it doesn't have that really young kind of smell to it, like that kind of cardboard smell that you can get from really young whiskey too.
Not a lot of nuttiness, at least not so far.
No, there's definitely not. It's a really simple nose. It's a pleasant, simple nose on there. It's inoffensive. It does not have the kind of layers that you think you need to explore that some of their bourbons do. It's a pretty straightforward experience.
Giving it a taste, I get a lot of those same flavors. Certainly some corn, vanilla, caramels. I get a little bit of wood. It flirts between that kind of cardboard kind of flavor and dry oak. So it's not overly aged by any means. But it's got some oak to it. more of that apple, and maybe just a little bit of that light citrus note.
Yeah, very light citrus note. I think when I'm trying to put it all together and encapsulate what the palate is like, what it kind of reminds me of is if you're going to get like sweet tea, but like McDonald's drive-through sweet tea after it's been on ice for a while and diluted down, so it's not super sweet, but it's that kind of flavor profile to it, where it's faint flavors. There's a sweetness throughout. There's a little bit of that tea influence that I get, but it's also that same kind of experience where, like when you get tea, and especially if it's diluted, the point is it's not going to have a lot of strong flavor to it, just enough so that it's not just water. But that's what this is. To me, this is like the tea of whiskey, with the 80 proof and just how gentle it is.
Definitely gentle. On the finish, I get a little bit of herb, finally, a little bit of kind of rice spice, faint pepper, some cardboard. None of those flavors are overpowering at all. Definitely spot on with what you were talking about on being easy to drink, kind of diluted down flavors. Basil Hayden is sort of been always my go-to bourbon to introduce people to bourbon. There's really nothing offensive to it. It's not high proof. It's not going to burn. There's nothing that's really off-putting by it. So it's a great place to start. I think that encapsulates how I feel about Basil Hayden. And
it should be noted, I mean, there is something to be said for balance. And Basil Hayden has that. It's not unbalanced towards being too sweet, though it is sweet. It's also not unbalanced with having just like kind of that sharp sort of cardboard flavor to it that you might get. This has a few things that you can pick up, but they actually are somewhat in harmony with each other, and they just kind of work. It's not punchy. It's not terribly interesting. But I think that it would be unfair to knock it without mentioning that the balance that it does achieve for an 80 proof bourbon that it is.
Yeah, I enjoy it. My last takeaway, you kind of had the tea concept. I get some like watered down vanilla syrup, watered down caramel syrups. Very easy flavors to appreciate. Again, it's balanced. It's good.
Yeah, definitely would be the one to recommend to someone that's wanting to maybe dip their toe into bourbon or even whiskey generally, as one that won't be offensive.
I don't think this isn't necessarily a review about the other Basil Hayden products other than the 2x2, other than just try to understand where the 2x2 is coming from. I don't know that we necessarily need to give overall observations or scores to the bourbon and the rye itself, but do you have any other overall takeaways from the bourbon?
I think the main takeaway for me is that it has a palate that's going to be very approachable, has some classic bourbon flavors in there. It won't be off-putting either with its strength or its harshness, and the balance that it brings, I think, makes it a good introductory bourbon. I think the palate is better than maybe both the nose and the finish combined, because neither the nose nor the finish really has much to offer beyond what the palate does. And so, I don't know, I think that is my main takeaway from Basil Hayden, and it makes me interested to see what kind of change in direction there can be when you're slapping that same label on a rye whiskey instead of a bourbon.
My added takeaway is my only criticism of the Basil Hayden would be the 80 proof. I would really love to see a higher proof Basil Hayden. I know everyone out there is going to say, well, we have Old Granddad, we have the Bottled and Bond and the 114. I've done some of these side by side. I've done some of these blind. The Basil Hayden's a more refined product. It's got a little bit more age on it than any of the Old Granddad products that are out there today. I'd really like to see it at a Bottled and Bond level, and I think it would be a really enjoyable product.
That would be interesting, but even like a bump up to, like it's not unlike Weller Special Reserve. Okay, another very inoffensive, gentle, introductory level bourbon, but that's at 90 proof, and what it can deliver more at 90 proof. I don't think you lose that approachability that Basil Hayden has. I also don't think you expose probably some flaws that Basil Hayden might have if you crank the proof up a little bit, just up to 90. I certainly wouldn't mind that at all.
Just don't put a really high price tag on it, Jim Beam.
Yeah, good grief. But what you were saying about the bring up to 100 proof or bonded, it would not surprise me at all if next year we see there's a TTB announcement that there's going to be Basil Hayden bonded is the next thing. And I think that would be a welcome addition to this line after some of the other experimental stuff they've done where they're like, okay, let's crank up the proof a little bit and see what happens.
Well, I've always had a theory that the whole exit of Old Granddad 114 was all about remarketing it as Basil Hayden 114 and just slapping a price tag on it that's triple or quadruple what we were normally paying for OGD.
Yeah, that'd be great.
All right, let's move on to the rye whiskey now.
And what I noticed right up front about the nose on the rye is if you're searching for something in the nose on the bourbon, you have to try even harder with the rye to find something. They're the same proof. We have no idea really the difference in age. But the nose on this, to say it's delicate and faint, can't be stated enough. I mean, it is hard to pick up exactly what's going on with this rye. I get a little bit of like some spearmint and a trace of dill on the nose with a little bit of just like that raw rye grain you might get from where they have the grains like actually in the bread itself. But other than that, my goodness, this is a faint nose.
It's very faint. Definitely get the faint herbal spices that you're talking about. But the biggest influence for me on the nose is the corniness. I get a lot of cornbread on this, like cornbread with just a slight amount of like herbal spice in it, like kind of the dills, the mints that you talked about in there, maybe a little bit of honey, a little bit of butter. Some of those same notes that we talked about on the Basil Hayden bourbon, the vanilla, the caramel, very, very faint, but it's to me more of that just very subtle cornbread flavors with some of these side spices on it.
Yeah, it's there's not hardly a trace of ethanol on this, and even following up the bourbon where we said the same, this is even less so.
I would say this comes across as younger, even than the bourbon. I can
see that.
And this is the blended with rebarreled quarter cask rye. My view on this, does it say straight on here anywhere? I'm the one with the bottle, aren't I? I don't see the word straight. I may be missing it, but I don't see the word straight on here anywhere. So really have no idea here on age whatsoever. But young, I get, and let me say, I like a young rye whiskey. I think there's some really good things to come out of young rye whiskeys. There's some 2-year-old rye whiskeys out there that I love right now. This just comes across as young, just not very well refined.
Yeah, generally rye doesn't take as long to mature as bourbon does. But one thing you might notice about rye then too is the younger ones aren't afraid to go higher with the proof then, and this does the opposite. I do notice a color difference too between this and the bourbon. This is a distinctly lighter color.
Cardboard, corn, maybe some more of those diluted vanilla and caramel syrups that I talked about before.
Yeah, there's also almost like a savory kind of saltiness there that I'm trying to identify what it's most like. But yeah, what you're saying about like those diluted sort of flavor enhancers, that is kind of the feeling you're left with. I mean, the finish is so quick. It does have at least a nice kind of oily texture to it. It's not too dry. It lacks the balance that the bourbon has. There are some things that I think you're trying to get past and figure out what else is underneath, and maybe there's just not much.
I get a little bit of light pepper on the finish, and some clove that comes in really late for me. That it's I know this is going to sound weird, but a kind of a clove texture to it. There's kind of a, I don't know. Whenever I've had clove and that clove flavor lingers in your mouth, it kind of coats your mouth in a weird sort of way. And that's what I get out of this.
Yeah, it ends up feeling almost like kind of sticky. At the very tail end of the finish is where it turns into.
There's kind of some bubblegum flavor around on this too, like mint and gum.
Yeah, like it's old and has kind of like that chalky coating on it.
Yep.
Yeah, I get that. As far as ryes are concerned, this isn't kind of the herbal or mint dill kind of bombs you might get with some of the younger ryes. This has I don't know, some other things that really try to complement those herbal flavors, but they don't come up enough to achieve any kind of balance or cohesion. There is that kind of sweet cornbread you talked about a little bit, and I still am trying to figure out whether it's like almost like a salty caramel or salty taffy kind of savory note too. But you get one and then the other and then the other, and they don't mesh. They don't come together very well.
As I mentioned, this reminds me a lot of Old Overholt 80, which for a $15 to $20 bottle that's generally used as a mixer, Old Overholt, it's a really good buy for what it is. When you're paying $50 or whatever this rye whiskey was selling for around here, it's a scam. I mean, it's you put those side by side, you're going to struggle to find any differences in them. I mentioned the quarter cask adds just a little bit of feint of age and refinement to it, a little bit different texture, but they're not markedly different for their price.
Yeah, just based off memory, what I remember is a little bit more of like some of the, like a little bit of a grassy note with Old Overholt, but also like picking up for an 80 proof rye, picking up more ethanol than I would have anticipated. Overall, though, pretty darn similar to this, similar enough that you cannot justify paying that added premium for the Basil Hayden Rye over the Old Overholt. And neither are terribly good on their own. Anyway.
All right. I don't necessarily want to spend any more time with that one. It's not my favorite.
Yeah.
Move on to 2x2.
Move on to 2x2. I think we can comfortably say that Basil Hayden did not improve at all by going into the rye direction, at least with just the Basil Hayden Rye. I think the bourbon, it seemed to achieve something that the rye was unable to.
I'll throw one more thing out there on the rye. I tried it first in a bar, and I disliked it much more than I'm stating today. I didn't like it at all. But I've got several other bottles of Basil Hayden, and so when it popped up or I found it where I could buy it, it was kind of sold out by that point. But I found one, and I decided to buy it, even though I don't like it. I like it better today than I liked it that first time in a bar, but it's still not what I expected from a Basil Hayden branded product in a rye whiskey form.
Yeah. If you're going to a bar and this is what you want to pick for your pour, especially if you're doing it in isolation, good grief, it's not going to do well for you. But if you drink it in comparison to other Basil Haydens, it might not be as bad.
There you go.
The 2x2, your first impression on the nose, is it more bourbon or more rye?
I'm more bourbon.
I think I'm
rye bourbon, but I'm more bourbon.
I think I'm definitely more bourbon. But I am getting a little bit more of that kind of rye bread character, even maybe not just rye bread, but just like wheat bread. You just get some kind of bread or grain along with that sweet diluted caramel kind of smell that you got with the bourbon. You can tell there's something else there, but it's like we said over and over, it's faint. But this smells like a bourbon.
Yeah, I get your breadiness. I wouldn't go quite like a marble rye or a pumpernickel or anything like that, but it's got a little bit of those kind of uh, molasses kind of sugar notes to it with that graininess, which isn't bad.
Yeah, it's fine. It replaces or maybe masks some of that cardboard that we were smelling with the rye.
Yeah, there's some oak here that helps more like actual oak versus the cardboard, and some sawdust even that takes away that cardboard and transitions more into the actual oak flavors.
Yeah, it smells older than the rye does. Yeah, trying to find the layers underneath that with this one is like the others. It's very tough to do. There's not a whole lot you can really get on the nose or study out of it.
I'm searching. There's some very, very faint fruitiness to it that I really can't describe. Maybe faint apple, but it's not like a deep cherry or.
No, it kind of smells like a really old stale orange starburst.
I got you there. Very faint, maybe some very faint citrus on there as well.
Yeah. This has an initial rye spice kick on the front end of the palate that the rye didn't have. That's kind of nice, but then it doesn't translate or develop into that deep rye flavor where you're getting the mix of like the herbal and the sweetness and maybe even a little bit of something savory. It's just there, and then it kind of dissipates, and then you're left with that, again, that diluted kind of caramel syrup, corn sweetness, a little bit of oak, maybe a trace of like vanilla extract. But for a second there's some potential.
Yeah, I agree with your second. There's some potential. When it first hits your tongue, okay, there's some of the rye notes, and you kind of expect sort of some other flavors to develop, and it just weakens. It gets watered down really fast. The watered down vanillas and caramels really kind of take over, and the whole thing is just left very, very muted.
Yeah, and I think maybe it might just be black pepper you get at the beginning, and not much beyond that. But it's one where I'm trying to figure out really what direction this one's trying to go. With what I'm picking up, it's almost like it's having its own identity crisis. I'm not sure what this is trying to do.
Yeah, the balance isn't quite there. I feel like I'm really picking up different qualities from the individual components as really pulling together. We talked about having some real actual oak flavors, maybe some sawdust flavors that gives it some age. But I'm still picking up on sort of that young, waxy, cardboardy, newspapery kind of flavors on the palate and finish. I get some very, very faint hints of leather, but at the same time, I get that young corn and young rye. There's a lot going on, but it doesn't seem to gel very well.
Yeah, I think maybe I'm getting like some peanut shell in there. Like on the back end of the palate and into the finish. The finish on this is the driest of the other of the three, which is kind of interesting, I suppose. And so I think it ends up having, I think, my least favorite mouthfeel of the three too, because of how it dries out.
Tannic on the finish.
Right. Yeah. That's what I'm thinking.
I don't know. I'm with you quite on. Has the mouthfeel would be the lowest on the three. It's not dramatically different because it still gives me that kind of diluted feeling on the whole experience, but maybe that kind of tannic hint at the end. I still think I like it better than how we were describing the rye whiskey, though. And I didn't really like the mouthfeel in it at all.
Yeah. If you dislike both, I think that's fair. We should score this one.
Yeah, let's score this. Let's go back and start with the nose. I'll let you start.
Yeah, the nose on this, just because of what I was trying to find, and still didn't after trying over and over and over again. Even after you drink it and you go back and see what you can rediscover. For us, a 2 out of 5 means we're less than satisfied. And I think that would describe my experience here. Would I go below that, though? No, I don't think so, but it's close enough that I'm thinking about it. So I just would give it a 2 out of 5. I'm less than satisfied by the nose.
I might be a 2.5, not because I like it that much more than you like it from a 2 to 2.5, but because I'm not seeing a whole lot that's off-putting on the nose. There's nothing that offends me. It's the absence of something is better than having something that's offensive in it. So I might steer a little bit more towards 2.5. I could live with the 2. That's going to segue into how I feel about some of the other flavors. There are some off-putting notes in the palate and the finish that might help draw my score down.
Yeah. As far as the palate for me, I would say it's an improvement on the nose, but I don't know if it's enough to really get me off of a 2. I'm still less than satisfied by the palate just based on its transition into the finish, so on the back end. But on the front, that's where I thought it had that potential, and that's why I'd say it, to me, is a little bit better than the nose. But because then that doesn't translate into something that I thought it might, and it ends up being unfulfilled potential, I think I'm still left as a 2 on the palate.
Yeah, I think I'm a 2 on the palate as well. Again, I would probably be at a 2.5 if some of these flavors worked better together, but they seem to contradict each other in some ways. For instance, the cardboard and the oak just don't really seem to play well together. That brings it down to me where I'm less than satisfied.
Mm-hmm. The finish to me is the weakest point, and that's where I think I would put it at a 1.5. Just that tannic turn that it takes. I'm not a fan of those really dry kind of finishes, and if it gets even the least bit tannic for me, that's going to get a downgrade. And I didn't pick up on anything to sort of counterbalance that and bring it back up. And so I think I'm at a 1.5 on the finish. I really didn't get anything that I enjoyed out of the finish of this at all.
I won't disagree with that. I'd be between a 1.5 and a 2. I think you articulated a 1.5 very well. I would go with that as well.
So what I'm going to do now is a very unscientific experiment by taking my bourbon and my rye and just adding them together to see if, here's what we're trying to find out. Is 2x2 rye greater than the sum of its parts or less than the sum of its parts? And so we've got a rye, we've got a bourbon, both from Basil Hayden, that I've just mixed unscientifically in a glass, and I'm going to swirl around. And I'm not going to give this the scientific comparison that maybe it thinks it deserves. I'm giving it exactly what I think it deserves.
I'm going to do the same thing, and I've got just a hair more of the bourbon than the rye that's mixing in. I don't know quite where you were at, but I'm going to do the same thing as well.
See, now when I smell this after mixing it in our unscientific experiment here, I get more of the bourbon on the nose, but I can tell there's something else, which is already an improvement.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. What I don't get is the added age that I'm getting with the 2x2. I definitely am pulling some added age that's absent when I just blend the two together.
Yeah. huh. The palate on that was kind of weird. With the bourbon flavors were what you initially get, but then it takes this little turn to the rye where there's just enough of that herbal characteristic that sticks around on the back end of the palate that took me by surprise. I thought the bourbon was just going to carry through those flavors were, but it didn't. It still is not cohesive in the slightest, but I can't say that it was worse than the 2x2 was.
Mine really came together very much in a bubblegum kind of fashion on the palate. I tell you what, this unscientific experiment, I think, produced as equal a result as some of these other experiments that Beam's actually putting in a bottle. I can't say that mine is really any improvement over any of them, or would be any better, but it's not much worse.
Here's where I'm thinking it's actually improved in the mixed glass I have here is on the finish. I don't get the tannic finish. I get the bourbon finish more than anything. And the thing is, Basil Hayden bourbon is just fine. If you don't like things that are 80 proof, you're not going to think it's extraordinary, and that shouldn't surprise you. But it is just fine for what it is. And apparently adding the Basil Hayden Rye to it does not ruin that completely. But then you get into the 2x2, and it doesn't seem to take you anywhere that you want to go, that just mixing Basil Hayden Rye and the Basil Hayden small batch bourbon would take you if you just mix them in a glass together.
Yeah, I think this all follows my analysis that I had on the Old Grandad. Old Grandad's a great $20 bourbon. You can't just slap a pretty package on it and make it $35, $40, $45 and actually enjoy it anymore. If we were to give a $15, $20 bottle scores of 2, 2.5, we'd say that's pretty good. That's what we anticipate. But when you put it in that $40 price range, it really doesn't hold up. And that's how I feel about all these Basil Hayden products. Is they would be pretty good for $20 products, but they're not $40 and $45 products.
No, you can go and get Four Roses single barrel for $40, and you will be so much happier than you will be with this. Yeah.
With that said, I don't want to serve Four Roses single barrel to someone who has no experience on bourbon. I still might want to have a bottle of Basil Hayden sitting around to give that person.
That's true. Yeah, you need that gateway experience to be a little bit gentler, for sure. But then after you get them hooked, they need to learn how to spend their money wisely.
And that's why I have a bottle of Basil Hayden that still has some in it. It's been sitting there for a while, but I have it back there for just that occasion. I've given it to that new person.
I think one thing that I consider as a conceptual takeaway here is that as someone that has by marriage watched every season of Top Chef, head judge Tom Colicchio has said something over and over and over again to contestants that is true, and it's that if you take seasoned ingredients and then you find that you have bland ingredients and you try to mix them to influence the bland ingredients, you will end up with just all bland ingredients. I think what may have happened here is Basil Hayden is meant to be a bourbon, and they had a good thing going with just their small batch bourbon, even after dropping the age statement. It's just fine. Like we said, you go in the direction of rye, and then you're saying, well, maybe we can improve on the rye by adding the bourbon back into it. No, you really don't. Just go back to the bourbon, go back to the seasoned ingredients. That's where it was at before, and just stay there.
Yeah, good observation. But are they going to continue to do exactly what they're doing? Are they going to continue to release a new rye whiskey? Are they going to release a new 2x2, a new the dark rye? Is there going to be a 2019 version of the same products? You mentioned Bottle and Bond. Now you're talking about something that we think would be an improvement. Is Basil Hayden not where they're just releasing sort of these one-off, put a $40 to $50 price tag on something and sell it just from the Basil Hayden name?
Maybe. I think a little bit of what we're seeing is that another product in that small batch line the Booker's Rye, being named Whiskey of the Year, and getting all these awards, and frankly, rightfully so, because it was amazing. Jim Beam, I think, really jumped on the rye train and really pushed out then, like with its Knob Creek Rye, its Knob Creek Rye store picks, and then Basil Hayden only after that started going into the rye direction. So maybe we've already reached the crest of that wave, and then it will begin to go back down. And we could perhaps see a spin-off of this Basil Hayden brand more in the bourbon direction. That might actually be something we like. That'd be great. Or they could continue in this rye direction that frankly doesn't seem to bring anything to the table of value.
You know what I just realized based upon your statement? The one that you didn't mention, the one that Jim Beam hasn't screwed with at this point, is Baker's. They've left it alone.
That's right. Well, that's because we theorize that Baker's has its own yeast strain that they use, or there's something else that further differentiates Baker's from the other small batch products. And so maybe it's best left alone.
Well, you know, I like Baker's. There's really no relationship between Booker's and Booker's Rye, or Basil Hayden and Basil Hayden Rye, any more than they would be if they made a new Baker's product. But like I said, they're leaving that one alone. Let's keep that one quiet. Maybe they won't screw with it too.
Yeah.
Any other takeaways here on the 2x2? Do you want to give a value or anything? You want to save that for the blog?
Now the only other takeaway is, listen, we know all the animals went on the Ark 2x2. We suppose that they all came off the Ark 2x2. But, you know, eventually the dinosaurs went extinct. Okay. And maybe the Basil Hayden Rye experiment needs to go the same way, as certain kinds of species that after they exited the Ark after the flood need to just go bye-bye. I wouldn't be too disappointed if Basil Hayden Rye and Basil Hayden Rye, etc., as this could just be aptly called, went the same way.
Let me ask you, and I'll leave this as my parting thought. I'm getting back on topic here because you're not. If they would have released these similar types of experiments and they would not have been 80 proof releases, would you be more interested?
If it delivered, not just on principle that, oh, because it's 80 proof, I'm coming in with preconceived notions or pre-formulated judgments. If it comes back and if you crank up the proof and I find that it's a better product, then I'm glad we did it. But I just don't know if that's going to happen with Basil Hayden, at least. So I don't know. I'm just not seeing it.
Well, special releases to me aren't intended for the newbie. Special releases to me are intended for the people who are in the know, who enjoy this, want to buy that new thing that just came out, just hit the shelves. I think they lose that market a little bit with the 80 proof crowd. The people who they're really trying to market to don't love 80 proof, so why do they keep doing it?
That is a good point. I'm not sure. The good people at Jim Beam, they'll just keep cranking them out, and that's just fine.
Yeah, well, they know how to make money at this, so I guess good for them. So anything else?
Nothing for me. I think my overall would end up just sitting at a 2. I'm less than satisfied by 2x2. For me, I get a 2 for 2x2.
2x2 I agree. 2x2. All right. Again, I'm Scott Hill. Read the full review at flightclubict.com. We'll have that up. We'll put a link here in the YouTube video. So hope you take a look at that. Signing off. Thank you, Stephen.
All right. Good night.